Good morning, everybody. Bore da I chi gyd. And it's a fantastic morning for you to join us here on this very, very special webinar, this very, very special food summit. And I know that on this call, there are businesses, organizations, community groups, and people generally interested in connecting around healthy and sustainable food. So a huge welcome to you all. Croeso I chi gyd. We will have simultaneous translation from English into Welsh. So if people would like to listen to the whole of the seminar in Welsh, please press the globe button. Also, please use the chat to introduce yourselves and share ideas throughout the webinar. We want the Q&A function to work just for asking questions to the panel and also to the leader of Cardiff Council, who'll be with us in the first half hour of the seminar. And so please, if you want to ask questions, use that Q&A function. Let us know who you are through the chat. Let us know what you're doing. And we'd love to see both lots of information about you and lots of questions, so don't hold back. Now, you've all joined us on a very special day at this Cardiff Good Food Summit, and there are events all the way through today, and at the end of the session, I'll let you know what else is going on. But this summit comes at a very important time. It's celebrating Cardiff's success at the Sustainable Food Places Awards, becoming the first place in Wales and one of only 6 places in the UK to achieve a silver award, recognising the city's pioneering work in promoting healthy and sustainable food. So the title, Thinking Big, What is the Future of Food in Cardiff, is about big ambition, and part of that ambition is to engage as many people as possible in this debate. I'm delighted that the strategy that will be launched today has been developed by over 2,500 people in Cardiff, and it builds on the fact that Councillor Hugh Thomas oversaw the citywide good food strategy from the council launched in 2019, when Cardiff was an absolute trailblazer as one of the first cities in the UK to develop a food strategy. So we have the council's food strategy and we have a people's food strategy working together alongside each other with this big ambition. So without any further ado, I want to introduce Councillor Hugh Thomas. He's been the leader of Cardiff Council since May 2017. I know personally he's a hugely ambitious leader, and with Cardiff being one of the fastest growing cities in the UK, Hugh's administration is committed absolutely to promoting inclusive growth. Major projects including a £300 million school building programme, 1,000 council houses being constructed by 2022, and boy do we need them, and significant transport infrastructure developments and a new 15,000 capacity indoor arena. But he's also very, very focused on his own area of Cardiff, Labour councillor for the Splot ward, where my mum was doctor for about 30 years. Wow. He's been in Splot since 2012. He's held a number of cabinet roles. He's a fluent Welsh speaker. He graduated in music. He has a master's degree in international relations. He's worked in IT, transport, international development, and as head of Christian Aid Wales. And I know he's passionate about culture. He's the Welsh Local Government Association spokesperson for culture, tourism and major events. He was a Core Cities UK cabinet member with a responsibility for culture and was a board member of the Cultural Cities Inquiry. And away from politics, he supports sport, culture and the arts, as well as being an outdoor enthusiast and keen cyclist. So a polyglot leader of Cardiff with a passion for culture, a passion for food, and a dad with a definite interest in future generations. Hugh, diolch yn fawr iawn am ddod. The floor is yours.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Jane. Thanks for that very generous introduction and comprehensive indeed. Bore da I chi gyd. Good morning, everyone. Mae'n wir bleser cael eich croesawu chi i'r gynhadledd yma sy'n cael ei chynnal mewn partneriaeth gyda Bwyd, partneriaeth Bwyd Caerdydd. My pleasure to welcome you already to this Cardiff Good Food Summit as hosted by the Food Cardiff Partnership, coming as it does at the end of the second Good Food Cardiff Autumn Festival. Over the last week, it's been wonderful, hasn't it, to see individuals, groups, organisations and businesses come together to encourage our communities to build a healthier and more sustainable local food system. We've seen local businesses like Bar 44, like Penland Pantry and Kindle celebrating healthy and environmentally friendly food by running specific Good Food Cardiff menu specials. On Sunday, we saw local people coming together to share food and ideas as part of the Community Meals Initiative offered by the Cardiff Food Justice Collective. And wasn't it brilliant to see Nathan Wyburn create a large-scale sculpture in Bwyd Park using locally sourced fruit and veg, which then got made into soups and stews and chutneys by inventive community cooks. I think all of those activities really show what a powerful force food can be for bringing people together, people with different views, different ideologies, but who nevertheless all share a love of food. And thank you everyone for taking part. And what better way to end this week of action than by hosting this summit, where we can look at how to transform Cardiff into the most sustainable food place in the UK. Can I just say up front how delighted I am that we've got such an impressive lineup of panelists and speakers, and can I thank everyone who's taking part, but also make sure that I thank everyone who's worked behind the scenes, not just to make the summit happen, but also the festival as well. For me, the great thing about this agenda really is the practical socialism and the active environmentalism which it represents. And I make no apology for that being aligned with some of my personal aspirations and ideologies. Providing healthy, affordable meals to all our communities whilst reducing our carbon footprint helps us to create a greener and a fairer Cardiff. So it's essential that we get this work right. I can say with confidence that the Council and its partners have been working tirelessly to deliver the necessary changes locally. Our efforts were recognised this year when Cardiff was awarded Silver Sustainable Food Places status, becoming the first place in Wales, and as Jane mentioned, one of only 6 places in the UK that have received that accolade. And the fact that we're now going for gold, I hope shows our ambition for the future. Today, we're taking the first step on that journey towards gold status by launching Cardiff's new citywide good food strategy. It outlines 5 big missions, all of which will play a crucial role in building the greener and healthier city we all want to see. It looks at delivering a healthy Cardiff where everyone can access and choose affordable, nourishing and culturally appropriate foods. It looks at the way food is produced, bought and consumed in Cardiff to help us tackle climate change and create an environmentally sustainable city. It looks at empowering our communities to work together in shaping their local food system and for people to have opportunities to develop new skills. It looks at healthy and environmentally sustainable food businesses so that they are at the heart of a thriving local economy and for people working in the sector to earn a decent living, of course. And finally, it looks at wanting a fair and connected food system with food-related issues and solutions included across all local policies and good food action fairly distributed across every part of the city. Cardiff Council's own food strategy is supporting these goals. We've included ambitious low-carbon food actions within our own One Planet Cardiff strategy in response to the climate emergency, because we need to recognise the environmental impact of our food choices. The production, transportation, processing and disposal of food is a major source of our local carbon emissions. So our One Planet proposals will support fresh, local food systems with a lower carbon footprint. And with our citywide partners, we've been working to drive up local and sustainable food production in recent years. Cardiff Council is proud to be a founding member of the Food Cardiff Partnership, and we've actively participated in the partnership since its inception back in 2014. Food Cardiff acts as a hub to connect people and projects working to promote healthy and sustainable food. As a partnership, it serves as a catalyst for changing the local food system in Cardiff and is frankly a voice for wider change. And since 2014, we've seen some incredible achievements. For example, the Sustainable Fish Cities campaign resulted in 5 million sustainably sourced fish meals being served across the capital each year, including in all council-catered schools. We then had the school holiday enrichment programme, Food and Fun, which was piloted to offer children meals, nutrition education, enrichment and physical activities. And, we've seen in the last year interventions, hugely positive ones by footballers like Marcus Rashford, brilliantly taking up the cause in England. But the SHEP programme was live and running in Cardiff way before that came into focus in England. And of course, in 2021, here the programme was bigger than ever. We had 1,200 children involved, 22,000 healthy meals served, and around 5,000 recipe kits were provided to 20,000 families to enjoy at home. As a direct result of Cardiff's innovation, Food and Fun has been adopted by Welsh Government and rolled out across the rest of Wales. It's been used as an example of best practice and has led, I think, to Wales being recognised as having the most advanced holiday provision in the UK. In the 3 years since launching our ambition for Silver Sustainable Food Place accreditation, the council became the first local authority in Wales, in the UK, I beg your pardon, to approve its own council-wide food strategy as well. That means we've supported practical projects such as growing 20,000 veg plants for community groups during the pandemic. And that's just part, I think, of the journey, 7 years. Now, looking forward, I want to see Cardiff continue to be a leader in this space. We've firmly got our set sights on the Gold Award, which is currently only held by Bristol and Brighton. And we've got a vision to transform Cardiff market into a sustainable and local food market. We've got developing plans to offer council-owned land across the city to community groups to use for food growing projects. And we are currently working on a new approach to food in schools and improving access to fresh food across the city. Finally, we are recruiting a food officer to help drive forward progress. But let me be clear, just as I conclude, to deliver real change, we will need everyone to get involved. All of our citizens, community groups, businesses and establishments can be part of the change. And I'm really confident, based on what we've seen in recent years, that we can all come together to achieve this. So I hope today's event will encourage and inspire you to get even more involved in the sustainable food movement in Cardiff and chart a course for the next few years. Thank you for all that you do, and I'm delighted to be taking part today. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Hugh, thank you so much. I just hadn't realised, having moved away from Cardiff to the wilds of West Wales in Pembrokeshire, as you know, I just hadn't realised just what an extraordinary amount of work that Cardiff is doing. The council, and we'll hear from Pearl in a few moments about, what is happening on that wider agenda and the massive number of people involved. But what I just wondered whether you could give a sort of message to, all other cities, as it were, about why this is really important. I mean, you've described the incredible movements here in Cardiff. You won't be surprised to know that your green socialism and active environmentalism is an agenda I support very strongly in the interests of future generations. But I'm just wondering why we're still having to trailblaze. So as a trailblazer, what can you say to other people who might pick this call up and look at what Cardiff is doing about the advantages to the city of taking this very inclusive and important approach that includes all its citizens, that is multicultural, that actually recognises the value of the city as a driver for change?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It's a great question, and I think for me there is a confluence of issues here, or almost a confluence of crises, where the good food agenda can speak and support in response. I've mentioned extensively the climate emergency, and I think the role of food and sustainable food in response to that is recognised. We've also, frankly, got an obesity crisis. particularly and very sadly amongst the younger age groups, with increasing numbers of children being overweight. There's a fantastic strategy locally in Cardiff aimed not just looking at the food side, but also on the physical activity side. But clearly, food is a major player into that kind of policy response. And then you've got rising cost of living, and you've got poverty, frankly, still continuing to blight too many people in our communities. That's identified as an issue in Cardiff, particularly in the southern arc of the city, but it will be an issue that will affect every community and cities in particular. And providing access to good quality, affordable, fresh food, to my mind, speaks to all of those agendas and makes a positive contribution. So I think then for local authorities, for city councils to be seen to be in the vanguard of that, but also enabling local grassroots solutions as well. Frankly, it doesn't cost that much. It just allows the council to unlock what people want to do and unlock that innovation at a grassroots level, and finally brings people together. Like I said, whatever your politics, we all like our food, I think. So in an age where division is pretty rife and culture wars are being played out, actually having something that can bring people with different views together in celebration and in practical activism together, and they finish the day with something delicious that they've grown themselves. I think there's something really, really positive to be said about that as well. So more power to your elbows to other cities to get involved in this agenda.
Thank you. I think that was a really persuasive argument for the fact that obviously food is one of the 4 main contributors to climate change, but it can also be one of the biggest solutions in the context of behaving differently in the engagement from food. And therefore, thank you so much, because I think that Cardiff's work will be inspirational, but the learning that has been done since 2014 will also help other cities, other towns look at the issues and actually see what they can learn from you and from other trailblazers. And of course, we've got a number of individual trailblazers who've done massive amounts of things on our panel today. So Hugh Thomas, leader of Cardiff, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you so much for your contribution this morning. And I'm now going to hand over to Pearl Costello. And Pearl is the person who asked us all to come today, which is very important in this context. And I've known Pearl for a number of years, because her role now, she is a sustainability change maker, and she leads Cardiff's Sustainable Food Places programme through Food Cardiff, and works on Food Sense Wales programmes to support local place-based action, and is passionate about empowering the people's voice into policy making, something that she's very much taken forward through Veg Cities. But I knew her when she previously led an ambitious and transformational sustainability programme at the Royal Agricultural University, winning multiple awards, including the Guardian University Award for Sustainability Projects in 2016, and this is the link, innovative engagement and behaviour change programmes with the National Union of Students, which my university, the University of Wales Trinity St David, engaged passionately with. So I know that Pearl is a tremendously strong advocate for sustainability, and a tremendously strong advocate for people empowerment in all major initiatives such as Food Cardiff. Pearl, over to you.
Thank you, Jane, and that was a very lovely introduction. Thank you. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today, launching Cardiff's new Good Food Strategy 2021 to 2024. I've worked for Food Cardiff. I've been coordinating the partnership for almost 3 years now. And what's really struck me is the amount of passion and engagement that people across the city have for good food, whether that's leaders, whether it's businesses, whether it's individuals making change in their own communities. And that really struck me and wanted to make the new good food strategy one that was developed across the city, not just by one person, not just by me, by all the various partners and also individuals who may not have heard of Food Cardiff before. So I will give you an overview of how it was developed, and then later today in the session this afternoon, I look forward to exploring a bit more of the detail about what it means and what we're actually going to start doing about it, and hopefully with your help get us to our goal of sustainable food places status. So the strategy development started off with a People's Assembly that the Sustainable Places Institute at Cardiff University very kindly led on, where 72 people got together from across the city on Zoom on a Saturday morning and spent a good 2 hours figuring out what they wanted to see from their local food system. We collated those responses, and then we went out to a bigger consultation. So over almost 2,500 people got involved through the public survey, through stakeholder engagement, through working with businesses as well. So I'm delighted to say that this new strategy is really co-produced by the people across Cardiff. But we know we need to do more as well. So I think 2,500 people is great, but we've got a city of almost 400,000 people. So how can we get more and more people involved in this? And this is what today is all about, is to kickstart that inspiration and involvement. So I will show you one video, which will come up in just a moment, which was what people wanted to see in the Cardiff City food region, which really formed the basis for this new good food strategy.
We want to see more food sustainably produced in our region. This means stopping farming practices that degrade the soil and supporting practices that build soil.
I think it would be good to see more regional cooperation between food producers and consumers generally. Speaking as a farmer, I think perhaps we've relied too much on just selling into the commodity market, and we've ignored our local consumers, but that does require cooperation on both sides, cooperation between smaller farmers and also cooperation between smaller food producers and consumers.
We want to end food insecurity and have a healthy and nutritious food for all. We could have healthy corner shops, for example, where the veg and food is subsidised.
We need education on growing, cooking and nutrition at every level, from nurseries through our primary and secondary schools, through colleges and universities, and right through all our communities.
We want to see affordable, seasonal, good quality food becoming the norm. This would mean a shorter supply chain and more appreciation of the real social and environmental costs of cheap food.
We need to protect existing green spaces and create a level growing field. There needs to be an increase in the amount of green spaces available and being used to grow seasonal fresh produce. We need to innovate and use more brown spaces.
We want to see communities working together to shape their local food system. We need more communication through food-focused fora and better connections between producers, consumers, public bodies and policymakers to ensure that action is joined up.
We're facing multiple emergencies, so we need a favourable political climate and legal frameworks that help to accelerate change and prevent practices that harm people and the environment.
Thank you. So that was our advert really to take part into the consultation, and I'm delighted so many people did. Just to finish off, saying thank you to Councillor Hugh Thomas for your commitment on this agenda, and it's really important to have this leadership within the council, and also our very, very many partners for being involved as well.
Thank you so much, Pearl. Can I just ask you a question about the huge number of people who got involved in the consultation? I mean, it was absolutely massive, you know, because I suppose it's this whole notion, as Councillor Thomas was saying, as, you know, food is everybody's business. But what do you feel is different about having had so many people involved in a consultation like this? What did it contribute in terms of changing the direction of travel for you? Because I think you were hearing all those different voices there, and there were such positive and supportive voices. And how were you able to change the strategy to adapt to those voices?
That's a really good question, because clearly consultation doesn't mean anything if nothing changes as a result of it. The voices and the responses were overwhelmingly positive, so we had a really a lucky starting point for that. But I think part of that came from the initial development was actually done in cooperation with very many people right from the beginning. So that second stage of the consultation, I think, was because it was already people-led, the responses were overwhelmingly positive. Where we identified a few areas where things did need to change. One of them was very much around the accessibility of the strategy and the language that we used, and how we can make that something that is accessible to everyone in the city, and something that people really feel that they can be part of and engage with, which is why we're launching it now, even though we'd signed up on it a number of months ago. We wanted to take that bit more time to look at the language, look at how we're communicating it, so that it is something that everyone can get involved with. So as a result of that, we've really focused on the 5 good food goals. There's a lot of content and there's a lot of action behind them, but felt like the 5 good food goals was a really clear way of explaining it, that people can get involved with if you've not got a background in food. We also had some comments around the awareness of the strategy and how it wouldn't be successful if, say, only one part of Cardiff met all of those 5 good food goals. It needs to be fairly distributed across the city. So that's affected the way that we're looking how we target the actions, so that we do make sure it's something that can happen across the city. I'm really pleased that we're actually piloting good food neighbourhoods at the moment. So we're working with Ely and Cllr and Trowbridge and St Mellons to develop their own local community plans that are really community led. We've literally said, take the 5 good food goals. What does this look like in your neighbourhood? So continuing on that idea of making sure things are fairly distributed and across the city.
Thanks. Can you just remind us of what those 5 good food goals are?
Absolutely. I'll get them up in front of me.
I was going to say, I think, I don't know if you can just share a slide, because just to put them up in front of people.
Yes, let me do that now. Here we go. So we've got our first goal is having a healthy Cardiff. We want to make sure everyone has access to, has choice over, and can afford nourishing, healthy and culturally appropriate food. One of the things that changed in this actually was deliberately looking at having access, choice and affording, rather than saying tackling food poverty, recognising that the issue is broader than that, and it's something that can be, using that language can be stigmatising as well. Actually, it's not often the case. Sometimes it's to do with access as well. The second one is an environmentally sustainable Cardiff. We want the way that food is produced, bought and consumed to benefit nature, tackle climate change and prevent food waste. Then goal 3, we want to see communities working together to shape their local food system, and that people can have opportunities to learn and develop skills in growing, cooking and nutrition. Goal 4, a thriving local food economy, so that healthy, environmentally sustainable and resilient food businesses are really at the heart of our local economy, and people working in this sector earn a decent living. And then finally, a fair and connected food system. Again, fair was added into this as a result of the consultation, recognising that this work does need to be done fairly across the city. So food related issues and solutions included across all local policies. And we've seen that today with the council's food strategy and with the Move More, Eat Well. But there's others we can work it into as well. And that people can work together to make sure that action is joined up and fairly distributed.
Right. No, thank you very much for that. I think it's really helpful to have those in front of the audience today, because we are seeking questions, but I think also we're seeking offers, aren't we? There's some incredibly knowledgeable and committed people on this call. And so, you know, what role can they play in this context? So we're not just looking for questions to panelists, but, you know, maybe people want to put something in around the way in which there could be more engagement at the local level, those sorts of issues. So thank you very, very much indeed. And, you know, and for the very, very best in the context of the development of this strategy. I'm now absolutely delighted to be privileged, in fact, to introduce Carolyn Steele. Now, whereas you know, Hugh and Pearl I knew already, but Carolyn I knew of, and she's certainly been the most amazing leading thinker on food and cities. And I've been really interested that she comes from an architectural background at Cambridge University. She's an author, she's an academic. She wrote the award-winning Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives back in 2008. But during the pandemic, she wrote, or rather published, Citopia, How Food Can Save the World. And I think it's really interesting about bringing together the ideas of food and place. And suddenly that has kind of like, you know, spanned a movement, which I think is directly related to Carolyn's expertise. She's taught in lots of universities, including the wonderfully named Slow Food University, as well as the LSE, Cambridge, London Met and others. And she was the inaugural studio director of the Cities programme. So this notion of cities and food is something I think is a really important proposition. And yet when she started her lecture series on food in the city, which was way back, turn of the century, 2002 to 12, that lecture series was the first of its kind. So we've taken a long time to understand this relationship between sort of food and politics and cities and opportunity. She does a lot of non-exec stuff too, because she is a non-exec of Kilburn Nightingale Architects, a trustee of the Oxford Symposium of Food and Cookery, is a research fellow at Aarhus University in the Netherlands. But I've certainly, you know, heard her speaking about food, cities and culture, and in particular, her 2009 TED talk received more than 1 million views. So, Carolyn, welcome to Wales. You're not going to get 1 million views today, but your expertise is so important to us as we move forward on this agenda. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Jane. That's a very generous introduction. And I have to say, it's very inspiring to be here and to hear about all the amazing work that's going on in Cardiff. And actually, I'm really just going to put all of that amazing work into a bit of context, I hope. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen at this point. This is where we all hold on to our seatbelts and hope for the best. But as you very kindly mentioned in your introduction, I'd better start my stopwatch. I wrote a book that came out the same week that the pandemic was declared, called Citopia, How Food Can Save the World, and which sounds like a bit of a bombastic sort of statement, I know, but actually I really do believe that food is totally central to all the big questions that we face today. And I should explain the word Citopia. It just means food place. And I invented it about 15 years ago now, as a result of studying the feeding of cities, as you also kindly mentioned, and, you know, just realizing that our lives are profoundly shaped by food, far more than we realize. So our bodies, our homes, our habits, our economy, our cities, our landscapes, and of course now our climate. And I just thought we needed a word to describe it. Because of course, once you recognize food's power to shape our world, you can then start to use it consciously to shape our world. And it's been doing that, of course, from the beginning. So, you know, the question of how to eat is, if you like, our oldest and most profound question. And we're still asking it today. And in a sense, we've got this illusion of having solved the problem. You know, so we've gone from hunter-gathering to farming to using fossil fuels to feed ourselves. You know, and we've also gone from living in nature, as it were, to living in a place we call countryside, to living in cities. And also what we do every day has changed. So instead of, you know, feeding ourselves being part of everyday life, we've gone through a period of handcraft and skill to a computerized world. And of course, that leaves enormous questions about the future and where we're heading. Now, we think of this as a sort of natural sweeping progression, but of course, every time you have a technological advance, there are downsides and externalities. And, you know, I find it very interesting if you look at some of the externalities of the way we feed ourselves today, and Hugh and Pearl have both mentioned some of them, you know, climate change, lost and degraded soils, obesity, diet-related to disease, even COVID, you could say. It becomes very clear that there is no such thing as cheap food. And so we're really in a crisis, and the crisis, I love this image. I mean, I don't love it, it terrifies me, but in a way it sort of sums up where the food system is going, this idea that there's a technological solution to how to eat. But in fact, it's an illusion, you know, which is why I love this quote from the British architect Cedric Price, you know, technology is the answer, but what was the question? And I think we're entering a neo-geographical age when we have to actually take our place in the world very seriously again. And of course, what that means is that, you know, thousands of years of questioning, you know, how to feed a city become extremely relevant again. And in fact, if you look at all of these utopian models of how to feed a city, you know, really from the beginning, people have worried about how to maintain a balance between the city and the countryside. And I think there's a lot in these models that we can learn from now. And in fact, that's why I went Greek when I invented my word Sitopia, because I think food is a sort of practical food-based alternative to utopia, through which, as I say, we can ask all the big questions we need to ask. You'll have to forgive this appalling drawing of mine, but it's sort of summing up really how I see the place of food in our lives, which is utterly central. And it's a bit like, you know, you can look at a bowl of soup or something and the whole universe is in that bowl of soup, because everything is affected, you know, from our social relations to, as I said, our economy, the relationship between the city and the countryside. And it's one vast system. And the key to this is that if we value food, then we do good all around the world in places that we can't even see. But if we treat food as cheap, we actually do damage around the world in ways we can't see. So it's an incredibly profound tool. And we have a series of choices about how we're going to produce food at every stage of the food chain. And, you know, they're just choices that lead to a better or a worse life. And I think it's very important to say that whenever we're talking about food, what we're really talking about is what is a good life, what is a good society. So it's really much bigger than just food itself. There's so many amazing examples, including in Cardiff, of course, of, you know, co-producing, Carlo Petrini's brilliant term of working together to sort of produce a better food system and rehumanizing the food system, because of course one of the things that the technological solution, as it were, to feeding ourselves has done is take out the human, embedding food in the way we think about cities and the relationship between the city and the countryside, making room for food, both in the city, but also in the infrastructures around it, such as with local abattoirs or, you know, food hubs in the city itself. Okay, that was my 5 minutes, but I'm nearly at the end, so I'll just do another 30 seconds. Obviously, regenerative farming, again, there's amazing models of how we can do this now, working with nature and not against it. So Sitopia is about seeing the world through the lens of food. It's recognizing that a good society is one in which everybody eats well, because as I said, it's not just about food, it's about everything that goes into that bowl of soup, which is the entire world. And it's about maintaining a balance between the city and the countryside. And this is really my favorite image of that. And I love the fact that it's called the allegory of the effects of good government. So they got it in 14th century Italy. And I think we need to remember these lessons from the old geographical age, because we're, as I say, in a neo-geographical age now. So that's really the idea behind Sitopia, is we can really get very close to utopia if we value food. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And my gosh, that was a canter through the ages. And you're absolutely right about that notion that, you know, if we look back to the 14th century or other centuries, you know, in a sense, particularly before the advances of technology, people understood the importance of food. They understood the importance of harvest. They understood and that a whole notion that we haven't even looked at yet in the context of the indigenous communities' understanding of the importance of food and how to grow it and the relationship with the earth and all these issues that we have so long forgotten and need to bring back into our current lives. I just wonder, one of the things, particularly with your architectural background, so you probably know I'm about to go with this question, is that there've been you know, a number of proposals over the years of kind of ecopolises, or the idea that the city itself can be architecturally designed to grow. And there's all sorts of issues that people are promoting around vertical growing, around aquaponics, around growing in lit sheds, and all sorts of things. Where do you think that technology fits into this debate? And also, how can food and issues around food and nature and the city potentially do something very exciting with the knowledge we have now that our forebears did not have?
Yeah, I know. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I think, you know, for me, the key word in all of this is balance, you know, which is why I'm so fascinated by Greek thinking, actually, because it's all about understanding that we are part of nature, you know, and food connects us to the two most important sets of relationships in our lives. So on the one hand, it connects us to our fellow humans, you know, other people, and on the other hand, it connects us to the natural world. You know, and I think for a long time, I mean, particularly since the Industrial Revolution, you know, there's kind of been this idea that cities are somehow autonomous. You know, you would sort of think, I mean, I began my Hungry City book by saying, think of the city and what do you see? You know, and of course, we immediately think of buildings, you know, and roads and, you know, sort of hard matter. And actually, I find it much more useful to think about a city as I often like to call them human nests, you know, because that immediately makes you realize, oh, it's an organic thing, you know, it's a living thing, a city. And, you know, I think we're coming to the end of a sort of a, you know, as I said, 200-year period of thinking that, you know, the city is somehow where everything happens that matters and all the rest of it, and somehow, you know, where it gets its stuff from, and the landscapes that feed it are somehow out of sight and mind. And I think that's now coming full circle. I mean, I love the background behind you. I would love to think that, you know, you could be sitting in a park in the middle of London and it would not just be a formal space, but it would have nut trees and it would have allotments. And, you know, there's the sort of idea that we can retrofit the city, not just with productive nature, i.e., you know, market gardens and orchards, which of course all historical cities had. All historical cities before the Industrial Revolution were extremely productive. You know, people kept pigs and chickens in their houses. Why? Because pigs and chickens are omnivores who can eat our food scraps. You know, so actually all of these models, this is why I'm so fascinated by history. I think we already have all the good models and all the good ideas. We just have to look back 200 years. And as you rightly say, incorporate the basic thinking, which is what I just call, you know, geographical thinking, i.e. geography matters, with technology. And this is a game changer. I mean, we saw under COVID that, you know, people discovered that, you know, the internet means they can live in the countryside and still work in a bank or whatever it is, you know. So I think there's incredible potential there to, as Patrick Geddes, you know, the father of regional geography, said, bring the fields to the street and the street to the field. You know, and actually I call this landscapes for human and non-human flourishing, sort of reimagining how we inhabit the land, because we need access to society and nature, but it doesn't have to be either or, you know, we can have both.
Now, I think that's a really important point, because, I mean, as somebody who keeps pigs and chickens,
brilliant, fantastic,
as much of my own food as possible organically, so that I'm also trying to build biodiversity. I think one of the extraordinary things for me when I left the city to do exactly that was that, A, it's not complicated.
Yeah.
And B, it pulls you back in time with the seasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also
absolutely
the sort of divorce from nature, which has been something that people have experienced and suddenly realized in COVID that reintroduction of nature was incredibly important.
Yeah.
I mean, what do you think about the kind of more guerrilla movements, in the sense of, incredible edible?
Yeah.
Was just a wonderful notion in
yeah.
about planting. Go on.
I think I love guerrilla gardening, and I think what it sort of, as you say, sort of amazing projects or happenings like Incredible Edible, where a couple of women just basically, if anybody hasn't heard of it, sort of re-inhabited a city in Todmorden in Yorkshire, and just bomb guerrilla gardened it, and it's become a really sort of almost a sort of place people go to visit just to see all these amazing kind of plants there. But I mean, I think what's wonderful about that, and I agree with you, Jane, I mean, I think there's because we've grown up, the whole, if you like, industrial capitalist sort of project, and that's what I was trying to get across in my very, very quick sort of summation of how we've got from hunter-gathering to living in cities. But what it does is it turns us into these helpless consumers. We're meant to just sit there, at our desks and receive ready meals and sandwiches that have just come from some place in the ether, and it's such a sort of disempowering and dehumanizing way to live. And I think everyone I know, and I also grow food on my tiny little roof space on the way up to my flat in central London, and as you exactly say, it re-engages you with worldly time. Because in March I have to think, oh, what am I going to grow this year? And I need to get my seeds over from Denmark, because I grow these kind of weird Danish cucumbers and my own seeds don't always work, and all this sort of, and then you've got in the summer, your plants become like little pets, and if you go away, you have to ask the neighbours to water them, and then suddenly in kind of September, October, it's like, oh my God, buy pickling jars, I've got to pickle all these ready, so, and I really love that. And it's very, as I say, I think and this is the thing about, saying that what we're really talking about is the question of what is a good life. I think to flourish as humans, as you rightly say, we need access to nature. We just saw that under lockdown, but we also need society. And I think food, because it sits at the nexus of those two things, there's so much there about how we can restore what gives life meaning, making stuff, growing stuff, sharing stuff, and food is just the low-hanging fruit, through which we can do all of these things. I mean, it's very interesting that, for example, that the transition movement, I remember chatting to Rob Hopkins years ago, and he sort of said, it's really interesting. When I started transition, I didn't realize how powerful food was as a sort of engager of people. But now it's always the food-based projects that really get people excited and get them involved, So I think there's a huge amount there that people are yearning for, some meaning in their lives, working with their hands, getting their hands dirty. And once you discovered it, you never go back. It's like a switch that goes back on.
Thank you so much. Well, certainly somebody who has really discovered how important food is our next guest, Dee Woods. Now, it's difficult to see what Dee hasn't done. She's a food and farming actionist. I love that word, Dee, who advocates for good food for all and a just, equitable food system, challenging the systemic barriers that impact on marginalised communities and food producers. And so her work is right at the nexus of just responsibility, human rights, policy, decolonial research, community and cultural practice. She's a co-founder of a community kitchen. She's a previous BBC Food and Farming Awards winner. She sits on the GLA London Food Board as a co-editor of People's Food Policy, an honorary research fellow at Coventry University, a member of the Food Ethics Council, chair of the Independent Food Network, and the list goes on. And I think what's really kind of important about having a contributor like Dee to us today is she has spoken around the world on food policy and food justice issues. She's a member of LION, Land in Our Names, a founding member of the Global Solidarity Alliance for Food, Health and Social Justice, an advisor on Farming the Future Fund, a flow funder with Be the Earth. And she recently became the West Europe focal point of the Coordination Committee of the Civil Society and Indigenous Peoples Mechanism for Relations with the UN Committee on World Food Security. Dee, a massive Welsh welcome to you.
Thank you for having me today. And, you know, both your work and Carolyn's work, and in fact, all work that happens in Cardiff has been really inspiring and influential in my own work as well. So where do I start? I start from the ground, from the grassroots, and from the margins, the edges. So how do we ensure that everyone can eat? How do we ensure that no one is left behind? How do we ensure that not only that people are heard, right, but people are able to participate? And that sort of guides everything I do. So it doesn't matter that I'm involved in policy processes, right? What matters is that people and communities are able to be part of that as well. So following from Carolyn, you know, one of my favorite authors wrote a piece about every cook can govern. And coming from a farming background, I grew up with a farming father. I started as a community food grower in London, and then eventually started connecting dots, right? How do we connect all these dots as to why people can't eat? Is it enough that we're just growing more food? And, you know, I'm so impressed with the strategy and how it's beginning to connect all these dots. But has it gone far enough? Sorry, on that person, has it gone far enough? Are we addressing the root causes of poverty? Are we unpicking and unpacking, you know, reasons why we eat the way we eat today? We live in a globalized food system, that I see as a plantation system where people from elsewhere are producing food for us, and we don't produce enough food here. So how do we change that? How do we decolonize that? By growing more food locally, but also having better trade relationships, because we can't grow everything here, right? As much as we'd love to. And in terms of meeting people's right to food and their culturally appropriate foods, not everything can be produced here. So we need to have those equitable and just relationships with people in other countries, and particularly in the global south. So how do we redress the extraction that has occurred over the last 500 years? And that extraction has been global. In the UK, you know, most of our farming system is industrial. Only probably about 2.5% is actually sustainable, organic, agroecological. So how do we change that? But also, and always bringing it right back down to community. How do we as communities come together and create that change? Always starting from the smallest denominator, not as individuals, but as communities. So how do we build resilience? During the pandemic, we saw how wonderfully people worked together as communities to ensure people could eat, to ensure that people could get their medication and so on. So how do we build on that? What were the elements in that? And, you know, I think my presentation today is about having people think and stretch and go that much further. All right, how do we build that community resilience? All right, how are we beginning to end poverty? All right, are food banks enough? Are food vouchers enough? Do we need to go further? All right, how do we ensure that people have living incomes? And I think it's for our local authorities and for our governments to ensure that people are able to access basic services, all right, to ensure that people have living incomes, all right, because those are the root causes of poverty and reason why people can't eat. We don't have food deserts, we have food apartheid, because someone made a decision somewhere that, yeah, certain areas wouldn't have food, that only certain shops would be in those spaces. So we need to have that participatory policy making where people are actively involved at all stages. So, you know, I'm really happy about this people's, you know, food strategy, because it's not going to work without people. We know what we want as people, right? And especially those of us in the margins, on the edges. We also want who know what will work. So I'm really, really happy that, you know, this process is happening, and I think it just needs to be built wider. Just reach out. Don't expect people to come to you. Reach out. Go to where people are and start having those conversations in your faith groups, in your community groups, in your schools, and start figuring out how are we as communities going to build this wonderful food system in Cardiff that is built on equity and justice and human rights.
Whoa, thank you so much. I mean, what a challenge to build a system on equity, justice and human rights. I mean, that's absolutely what needs to happen. And Dee, I was reminded when you were talking about, you know, that fundamental question you asked at the beginning about unpacking how we got here. I actually remember exactly where I was the moment I learned that we only grow 3% of the fruit and vegetables that we need to eat in Wales on 0.01% of the land.
Exactly.
So this ludicrous notion where Wales is seen as a farming country and an environmental and a green country, and we have plenty of land for growing, and yet we grow this tiny amount in terms of the population. So that dislocation is there in everybody's life, in everybody's day of their lives. So just a quick question to you, because I know there's lots of questions coming in, so I'm just taking Chair's prerogative. But I was particularly interested in the notion of how you build community resilience through food. And with this launch of this people strategy today, are there any lessons from other work that you've done about how this can absolutely help in resilience?
I think, you know, when I speak about resilience, I'm speaking about relationships. We build relationships through sharing food, through cooking food, through growing food together, and, you know, using those relationships to build those relationships of exchange. You know, academics, I'm not an academic, would refer to it as a circular economy, or, you know, reciprocal economy or something like that. But that's how we build resilience, and we examine where we are weak within our societies. I think part of the impacts of the COVID pandemic sort of revealed just where we are weak, that our supply chains, our food supply chains aren't strong, right? Because we import so much food and don't produce enough locally. So, how do we relate to our farmers? And the Farmer in Pearl's video was right. We need to connect. We need to connect the rural to the urban, and that bit in middle, the peri-urban.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And start, educating people both ways, and not being afraid of each other's cultures and economies and whatever else, because at the end of the day, we're all one, we're all interconnected, and we're all interdependent on each other and on nature.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, because that notion about, food producers, whether or not you're bottling, preserving, growing, there needs to be that needs to be a movement, not separate sectors. Yeah. And on that, thank you. That was absolutely
thank you so
wonderful.
Much.
And now moving on to our last panelist contributor for this morning, and this is very much the last is not least. Nirushan Sudarsan is a third-year Cardiff University law and politics student, absolutely passionate about social action, with experience in working on campaigns about employment and education, a leader within Citizens Cymru Wales, focusing on tackling inequality, poverty, wages and discrimination in the communities of Cardiff. Sits on various boards and forums, WCIA, Grange Pavilion, part of the National BAME Youth Forum, Peace First Ambassador, Team Panel at National Theatre Wales and Race Alliance Wales Steering Group. And you haven't, and you're still at university, so you are going to have such a CV and have one already. Huge welcome to you. Over to you.
Thanks for that, Jane. Yeah, I mean, it's been great to be part of all those things and get experience from that. Good morning, everyone. As Jane said, I'm Nirushan and I'm a leader with Citizens Cymru. We are a Citizens UK chapter with having members from an alliance of schools, universities, mosques, churches, refugee sponsor groups and community organisations. Together, we organise and campaign for local justice in our communities. Our member organisations across Wales have also been contributing to the common good through community organising. Through organising, our main aim is to listen to communities, form a team, relate to people in power, and hold decision makers to account. We tip the balance of power back towards people facing injustice. And I'm really pleased to see the previous speaker mention about some of the root causes of food poverty and lack of access to better quality and standards of food, because I'm here to talk about our Real Living Wage campaign in Cardiff and how that plays a role into the issues we are talking about on poverty and food quality. Our campaign is to ask every employer to step up and ensure that all their staff and contractors, from cleaners to security guards to catering staff, get at least the real living wage. For those that don't know, the real living wage is paid by employers on a voluntary basis. It is an hourly rate which is independently set from government and updated yearly. It's calculated according to the basic costs of living in the UK. The calculation takes into account a basket of essential goods and services and provides the amount a worker should earn to give their family a basic but a better quality standard of living. One of the most important elements in our campaign, which I wanted to share, is breaking down wide societal problems into issues. An issue is effectively a slice of problem that can be worked on. This is what we do in our work with the real living wage in tackling poverty. The gap between the legal minimum and the amount needed for families to live on was having a huge and big impact on people from all walks of life. Some people were working 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs and still struggling to make ends meet. From our listening through communities across Cardiff, and particularly in around the areas around Cardiff South, we realized parents and children were telling us it takes a huge toll on family life. We need to make sure that the jobs we are creating in Cardiff are real living wage jobs, so that people can support themselves and their families. The aim of the living wage is that no one should have to do a day's work for less than they can live on, and have access to a better quality of life through more time for family, social activities, better access to food and quality of food. I understand the importance of vital and immediate services such as providing advice, support, and food banks. They played an important role in supporting families and communities and have done an immense job supporting people, especially in the past year. But through community organizing and our campaign for a real living wage, we are looking at addressing the structural and root causes of poverty, inequality, and food quality in our city. There's a really good quote from Desmond Tutu which highlights this. He says, there comes a point where we need to just stop. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. This is really important. And this is what we're trying to address through the real living wage, and ensuring that no one should have to do a day's work for less than they can live on. Our work is not possible without the work of our partners and the City of Cardiff Council, who are working with us on our real living wage campaign. This has led to putting thousands of pounds back into workers' pockets, and has led to Cardiff becoming a real living wage city. There is still a long way to go until we have a clean sweep of accredited living wage employers across the city of Cardiff. But there is real progress in addressing poverty, inequality in our city. I think I didn't want to speak too much on just our campaign, but I think I will say this as my closing comments. I think it is, even though we are looking at the issue of food and the importance of that, it is important for us to understand that poverty and inequality causes of food poverty and lack of access to a better quality of food. And I encourage all of us who are leading and working towards that we as a collective are working towards justice and a brighter, more equal and clean and green city of Cardiff. And one of the ways we can do that is making sure people have the right support, the right amount of pay, and have that to be able to give them access to a better standard of living and better access to better quality of food. So it's really important for us to think about the justice in this, and for Cardiff to become truly more equal and more equitable for people of communities from different parts of the city. It's important we realize that the message this sends and start looking at some of the root causes of the issues that we're talking about. Thank you.
Nirushan, thank you so much. And you're right, this is an incredibly important issue. And it's a really important issue in terms of government and local government actually being very clear about the importance of citizens having better chances through the real living wage. I remember when the Welsh Government introduced the idea that all universities should become real living wage employers. And that has happened, but it's taken some time. And I think it was quite shocking to us in universities to find that we weren't doing it anyway, that there were so many of the staff who were below the real living wage. So it's a really, really important campaign. And Desmond Tutu also said this wonderful quote, which I in fact used in my book, is, Wales may be a small country, but she sure kicks like a mule. So let's make sure that we kick like a mule on the living wage issues. I think in the context of this food strategy, I mean, I'm assuming that you're particularly also interested in the wages of those people who contribute towards food, because that's always been low, hasn't it? and what you're able to do in terms of supporting that.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we talk about, you know, some of the listening we did, especially through some of the communities, a lot of the people worked in that kind of sector and had those kinds of jobs. And we realized, I think, is some people we spoke to didn't do just one type of work, but they did 2 or 3 other jobs just to, you know, make ends meet. And I think the idea of the real living wage is that every worker, no matter where you are based, what sector, what you do, whether, you know, you are working within food, contributing towards food, or whether, you know, you're frontline staff at restaurants or work in hospitality, is that everyone has the right to have that standard of living. And it's really important that, you know, the real living wage plays a champion role in that. And I'm glad, you know, Cardiff has taken a leading role in this, but we all have a role to play in making sure the people that we work for, the people that we know as employers and have these relationships, we champion the real living wage, because it not only addresses some of the root causes of poverty and what that turns into, but it's also about benefits for the employer as well. And I really encourage anybody to go away and look at Cyngor Cymru's website, look at the benefits it can do for employers, because I think this is a relationship and it's about communities and employers, and how that is better for us as a city of Cardiff to get to a more equal and clean place in the future.
No, thanks very much. And panelists, if we can see you now, we've got questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask each of you one of the questions, so you can guess which one is coming your way, perhaps. But can we start with you, Pearl, in the context of the question about Goal 5, a fair and connected food system, and could Cardiff Council have a look at the policies operating in allotment sites across the city and try to incorporate the needs of community growing groups and community orchards?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting that you brought that one up in Goal 5. We've got a lot of it in Goal 2, which I will go into in a minute, of what we're planning to do around that. But what we do need to do for Goal 5 is actually map out which policies exist in the council in other areas, and look across and see how effective they are. And I think there's a lot of them that are effective, and we can have a look at that in that context too. We'll just get up the food strategy so I can refer back to it. So in Goal 2, in an environmentally sustainable Cardiff, the goals, the actions that we're going to be taking are to support the development of the Edible Cardiff network, to increase the number of community gardens, the number of people involved in growing, and increase that knowledge sharing and skills. And I know also Edible Cardiff are doing a lot of work on access to land. But I think also very relevant to the question is around working with Cardiff Council to develop their own food growing plan for the city, which they've committed to within the council's food strategy. And I know at the moment, finding the details, that the parks in Cardiff are developing community tenancy agreements for allotment plots, because one of the barriers is around allotments being for single usage rather than for groups. So it's certainly something we're looking at, of how can we get more, how can we get the legal framework for community groups to access allotments better.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, I think there's also more informal arrangements that can be used. I know that sometimes it's, as a previous minister who tried to change allotments legislation, which turns out to go all the way back to, I think, 1926, and therefore is incredibly complex, actually. We just found here that actually getting farmers to release fields, because they're allowed to do it for agricultural use anyway, is a really, really good way of getting a lot of community growing. So not just about explicit opportunities in allotments, but also more widely. Dee, I wondered if I could ask you the question from Katie Palmer in terms of Welsh Government's planning to develop a good community food strategy. I mean, it's a relatively new government following the most recent election. It's committed itself to a community food strategy, but we don't know yet what that will look like. And I just wondered, from your experience in terms of people power, you know, how could you see the work of Food Carver contributing to that strategy? And what is the one outcome potentially of a strategy like that that you would like to see?
I think, you know, the Cardiff strategy could definitely contribute to that. I think, you know, as I said before, I think it's important to reach out to people and to use different ways of connecting to people, and not just flat surveys or consultations, but actually having proper focus groups and speaking to people. I think a community food strategy is important in terms of localizing the food system so that it actually benefits areas, local communities, rather than an attempt at one size fits all. So it is about, you know, having a diversified policy that's more responsive and sort of resilient to shocks and changes. I think what I would like to see out of that is that people are actually not only involved in sort of making that policy, but also delivering it. So actively involved throughout it, through some sort of, I think this goes beyond a food policy council, but having some sort of accountability mechanism built in.
No, I think that point about accountability is absolutely crucial. Otherwise, there's a danger that food policies or strategies become they have shelf life. We don't want them to have shelf life. We want them to have real life. Carolyn, can you pick up Professor Kevin Morgan's question on why does the UK have such a Stone Age policy for our food system, when the UK food movement, and your work in particular, has highlighted an enlightened vision for sustainable food?
Brilliant. I love it. Well, it's wonderful that Kevin's here. Hi, Kevin. Great to hear from you. It's such a brilliant question. I mean, I puzzle about this all the time, and I think the answer is that, you know, we went through an industrial revolution earlier than any other nation on earth. What an industrial revolution does is it takes people off the land. You know, it destroys the peasantry. And of course, our peasantry was deliberately destroyed because they needed people to work in factories. You know, I mean, I can't think of a more, I mean, disempowering and kind of deracinating act. And of course, you know, although other countries have industrialized since, they've done it, apart from China, who's done it in a similarly brutal way. You know, most countries have done it sort of much more gently and in piecemeal ways. So that actually, for example, in France, you know, and also to do with the way the sort of the land kind of ownership laws work in France, a lot more people still have some kind of, you know, relationship with the countryside, or some uncle who still's got a bit of land or something. So it's just a very, I think that's part of it. And I think the other part, so when we moved into cities, we became very dependent on industrial food. And actually, it's very interesting that if you look at the evolution of industrial food, such as tinned food, canned food, and then, of course, industrial meat, which starts to come online in the mid-19th century, Britain very rapidly becomes the biggest importer of all of that kind of stuff, you know. So you've got that in the mix. You've also got the creation of a very vicious class system that I think, you know, is also sort of, I mean, it's wonderful to hear both Dee and Nirushan talking about, you know, inclusivity and the fact that, you know, why do we in Britain have these vast pools of people who just seem to be sort of fall outside, you know, the kind of the main thrust of being able to earn a decent living and so on. I mean, this is all a legacy from our history, and it just perpetuates. And, you know, for me, I mean, and the final piece of the puzzle, actually, I'm afraid, is the so-called special relationship with America, which after the Second World War meant that, you know, we aspired to the kind of American vision of a good life, which is all about supermarkets and ready meals and all of that. So, for example, another of my favorite stats, you know, in Britain, we eat more ready meals combined than all other countries in Europe together. You know, so we have this, you know, we've lost our traditions. I mean, it's also to do, of course, with the sort of, sorry, it's a very long answer to a rather short question, but I mean, there are many reasons why we have a particularly industrialized food system compared to elsewhere in Europe. We're actually in a way much more aligned to America than we are to other European nations. And I mean, you know, we'd be the only country in Europe that did not put regulation in limiting the growth of supermarkets and protecting city centres until the 1996, which was about 20 years behind anyone else. So all of these reasons, we are kind of where we are. We have a very highly industrialized food system and food culture, and we've got used to cheap food, you know. So again, if you look at all the stats, you know, British people spend less time eating and cooking than most other European nations, and of course a lot of people don't have the time because they're working so hard just trying to get, you know, put food on the table. So it's a legacy of industrial capitalism, the way it's played out in this country, the class system, a sort of a cultural shift. And I think all of these things can and are being addressed. But, you know, we have to recognise we're coming from a sort of quite an impoverished place. People have been de-skilled. They don't have access to land. And a lot of what, you know, the food movement in this country is doing is trying to patch together and give people back, you know, that sort of direct connection with food that you know, was taken away brutally, I would say 200 years ago.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And Dee, I know you've got very strong views on this too.
Yes, I think, you know, building on what Carolyn said, you know, we've sort of developed policy in this country in very siloed ways. So dealing with issues rather than as a system, and, you know, looking at it in an integrated way. And in fact, last time we had any sort of really proper food policy as the UK was during World War II.
Yeah.
So, you know, with National Food Strategy in England, it is an attempt at some sort of integrated food policy. But we still have some way to go. And if we look at sort of global food policy, which, you know, literally just dived into, you know, it is very much the same. It is still based on issues and not really integrated sort of problems. And it is very much industrialized and focused on business. So we have a fight as people to try and bring people and rights and justice right back at the center.
Yeah, no, thanks very much indeed, because it's there is a lot to address, I think we can say.
Yeah.
Nirushan, can I ask you to pick up the question from Steve Garrett here? Well, he's actually put a double question in, effectively, but it's this notion that comes straight back to affordability, but also if there has to be a focus on a food strategy that everybody can afford to, and if they choose each well. And partly it's about how we tackle the marketing by junk companies. I mean, exactly the same issues we've got in climate at the moment. You know, you look at the fossil fuel companies and you'd think they're all incredibly green till you get underneath it. So we've got some, you know, messaging and delivery are in the wrong place.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complex thing to tackle in one element. I think for people to be able to afford good food, I think there's a simple answer to that, is making sure employers pay a decent amount of wages so people can, you know, shop more sensibly and buy products that are locally grown and able to afford them. So I think, you know, the emphasis on the real living wage there. In terms of the marketing messages and what we can do about that, I think it's also important for us to realize how education can play a role in this, and what we do with people who are seeing these messages, accessing these messages, especially young people, and what they're actually showing and the meaning behind those messages. I think there's still a long way to go in educating young people about what they see online and what is healthy and what isn't. I think, you know, when you have access to information that is on your phones, tablets, or laptops, and young people are seeing all sorts of these crazy, really fancy adverts and messages and branding by these massive companies, they won't be able to make that judgment themselves about what they're seeing and the meaning and results behind it. I think there's an element of imposing restrictions, but that can only do so much. I think there's the next stage of making sure we educate people about the meaning of those branding messages, but also about, you know, the strong encouragement of shopping and buying more locally. I think, you know, as communities, we can all take responsibility in supporting our local businesses, helping them grow and flourish. And I think to be able to do that, it's about making sure you build those relationships, have those conversations, and think about, you know, your ideas of where you shop now, and think about who you can actually support in those communities. I think, you know, all these factors can play a role in making sure people have good access to a better quality of food, tackling that inequality, and making sure people understand the messages behind, you know, some of these big branding companies. Because as individuals, we can't compete on the scales of these big companies, but as a collective, we can do something with that in our communities.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for an absolutely amazing session. I mean, it's one of those ones, you know, it's a privilege to chair it, but it's also one I'm really glad I was at. I think that's the best sessions. Pearl, can I just hand over to you for a moment for you to tell us what else is on today? Because, you know, I saw a very interesting proposal from Steve Garrett about ploughing up Pontcanna fields, and then just kidding, but you are doing an interactive session in terms of ideas later, aren't you? So
yes, and thank you everyone, thank you all of our panelists. You've given me so much inspiration already, and I hope our attendees feel the same. Yeah, this is just the start of our summit today, so we've got 2 more sessions. We've got a lunch at 12:30. So some people will have pre-ordered food, but if you haven't, you can still bring a bite to eat. And we'll be hearing from Fiona Kinghorn, Executive Director of Public Health, and from Women Connect First, a project that are doing a lot of amazing work around cooking. And you'll have a chance to have a bit of a network, meet some more people in the partnership. And then this afternoon is all about how do we make all of this happen? What comes next? So at 2 o'clock, you can join in. We'll be talking more about the strategy and our ambitions for going for gold, and we'll have breakout groups around the 5 different food goals, so we can start actually coming up with some of these ideas and seeing where it's going to go from there. And I'm sure we can pick up on some of the other questions that we didn't have time to answer or discuss. But thank you, and thank you, Jane, for your fantastic job chairing as well.
Well, thank you very much. I think that Deirdre definitely has given us the last word on Good Food is Life. Apologies for anybody who did try and use the simultaneous translation. It turned out not to be available. So Mandrugani, roedd e'n anhosib heddiw. I'm sorry it wasn't possible today, but the commitment to be bilingual is very, very strongly there. Fantastic panel, fantastic session, and very important now that everybody who's on the call goes away thinking about what action they can take to contribute towards this